Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, everywhere we turn in the Middle East, we see fighting and war, death and destruction, and today is no exception. As we take a hard look at the results of the ceasefire in Syria, as well as what one young girl has to say about all this fighting and killing going on in her country of Yemen. But first, the unthinkable in a small town right here in the United States. A mother's worst nightmare becomes reality on September 28, 2016. Tiffany Osborne of Townsville, South Carolina, was working when she heard the news about a shooting at the town's elementary school. Well, knowing that her son was homeschooled, she thought he was safe. She later learned he was the shooter. Her 14-year-old son is now accused of killing his father, Jeffrey Osborne, and also wounding 2 students and a teacher at the school.
Students from Townsville Elementary were entering the school playground for afternoon recess. The teenager began shooting. Teacher Megan Hollingsworth was hit in the shoulder as she pulled the children back into the school, and 2 6-year-olds were also shot, 1 in the foot and 1 in the leg.
Townsville Fire Chief Billy McAdams was first on the scene along with firefighter Jamie Brock, who found the teenage shooter with a handgun and was able to pin him to the ground. Now, McAdams expressed clear distress and grief over the event in a local news broadcast, saying, "Yesterday, our community experienced a very devastating and life-changing event. We're going to feel this for a real long time." Now, McAdams' son also attends the school.
Right. While emergency services were rushing to the elementary school, another 911 call was coming in saying that a man had been shot dead. Tiffany's in-laws, had received a call from their 14-year-old grandson just before he began shooting. He was crying uncontrollably, and they couldn't make out anything he was saying. They rushed over to the home where he lived with his mother and father, only to find their son, 47-year-old Jeffrey Osborne, dead, and their grandson nowhere around.
The teacher and 1 boy who were shot were released from the hospital the same day, but most severely injured, however, was first grader Jacob Hall. He remained in critical condition but could no longer hold on. He passed away this past Saturday, October 1st.
Well, the 7-day ceasefire in Syria, which was brokered by the U.S. and Russia, has officially ended, and it's unclear if it will be prolonged. While the violence had lessened considerably during the 7 days, there were constant accusations from both sides that the ceasefire had been violated.
Even though further steps had been planned, it seems that all sides were not ready to move on to take those steps. Initially, it was expected that the Russians and the Americans would start coordinating their air campaigns against both ISIL and Fatah al-Sham, formerly named al-Nusra Front.
But neither the Russians nor the Americans are happy about how the truce went and are blaming each other for not meeting the terms for continued cooperation. The Russian Defense Ministry claims the truce was only observed by the Syrian government and that it gave rebels the opportunity to regroup.
Russia also blames the Americans for not influencing the so-called moderate opposition, failing to convince them to separate from groups like al-Nusra. In fact, they say that they've merged even further, and at the same time, the opposition are blaming the government for violating the ceasefire.
Despite stopping short from fulfilling its goals, the ceasefire did manage to bring some relief. John Kerry was in fact optimistic when he met with his Vatican counterpart in Rome to discuss Middle East issues, among other things. He told reporters that the basic ceasefire was continuing to hold and that aid trucks were moving to 8 or more locations, and he remained hopeful.
The recent U.S.-led airstrikes caused the Syrian army to lose some strategic positions against ISIS in the area. Americans weren't the only ones involved in the strikes. The Australians have come forward, as well as the UK, both confirming their involvement.
Well, looking back a bit there, Jeff, there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether the ceasefire would hold even through its 7th day after the 31-truck aid convoy was targeted just west of Aleppo, and on the 6th day of the ceasefire, in fact. The strike destroyed 18 of the 8 trucks and killed at least 20 people, causing the United Nations to just halt its operations in Syria completely. The convoy was due to deliver food and medical aid for 78,000 people living in eastern Aleppo, and it is estimated that there are 250,000 civilians facing severe shortages as a result of the siege on the city. So it doesn't seem like they're really making any headway here.
Right. Well, some are calling it a terrorist act. Deputy National Secretary Advisor Ben Rhodes issued this statement from the White House indicating Russia was to blame. First of all, he said, all of our information indicates clearly that this was an airstrike. That means that there only could have been 2 entities responsible, either the Syrian regime or the Russian government. In any event, we hold the Russian government responsible for airstrikes in this space.
Well, an audio recording of the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry reveals his frustrations over not being able to end the crisis in Syria as he talked with a group of Syrian civilians behind closed doors. The 40-minute candid conversation took place during the week of the UN General's Assembly in New York and was leaked to the New York Times, who broke the story.
In the recording, Secretary Kerry was speaking with about 20 representatives from different Syrian opposition groups. While we don't have the original recordings, we do have the gist of what was said by the Secretary of State.
He said, I think you're looking at 4 people in the administration who have all argued for use of force, and I lost the argument. I've argued for use of force. I stood up. I'm the guy who stood up and announced we're going to attack Assad because of the weapons, and then, things evolved into a different process.
Kerry continued, a lot of us wish there was an enforcement mechanism right now a lot of us have been fighting for. But we don't have it right now in that sense. We're trying to pursue diplomacy, and I understand it's frustrating. You have nobody more frustrated than we are, he said.
Well, we know the lives lost in Syria have been enormous, but Tom Hartman of RT just announced a new report coming out which shows that with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, 1 million Iraqis were left dead.
Wow, 1 million.
That's right, which, in case you're wondering, is about 5% of that entire country's population. Wow. So it's a lot of people.
Well, we've talked about the plight of children throughout these war-torn countries, but one child has gripped social media with her heart-wrenching message in a way we have not seen. She comes to us from Yemen's capital, and at 10 years old, very eloquently expresses the fear and sorrow of her people from a child's point of view. Let's take a look at what she has to say.
The 26th of March 2015. Almost 12 a.m. It's the night before my concert, my second term's concert. I was really excited to attend the concert, but as I woke up and got dressed, Mommy told me that war against Yemen has started. And tons of people are dying. And all people lost their jobs. My dad lost his job also. My family, all the families are really maybe gonna die. I don't want to be the second. I don't want it to be my turn to die as a child. I want to live all my life. I want to be a doctor. I want to be an engineer. I want to grow up and be something important in this world and make the world more important.
Interesting. Well, in an interview with RT, the 10-year-old named Yara explains further what life is like for her and the Yemeni people. She said, in these days, we stay at home. We're afraid that we go to a place and they bomb it. We're always scared. We never stop thinking of death. She said, we think of death always. She also went on to say how people, particularly the children, have no freedom because they live in constant fear. She said it's like a nightmare.
Well, just last week, Katan, a Saudi-led coalition airstrike killed at least 20 more people in a port city of western Yemen there in her country. Well, according to a human rights watchdog, the airstrikes are deliberately targeting hospitals and schools, killing and injuring innocent children.
Horrible. Well, the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, caused an uproar around the world with his recent comments where he compared himself to Hitler. That's right, and wanting to get rid of a group of people in his country. He said, quote, Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there are 3 million drug addicts there, and I'd be happy to slaughter them. Yeah.
Duarte continued, at least if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines, pointing to himself, would have, my victims. I would like it to be all criminals, to finish the problem of my country and to save the next generation from the perdition.
Wow. Well, he eventually end up wiping out everybody because by their laws, or by the laws, seems like everybody eventually is some type of a criminal. Well, the defense minister of Pakistan raised the threat against India to a new extreme. Khawaja Mohammad Asif openly threatened India with a nuclear war, and in an interview with a Pakistani channel, the defense minister said special bombs will be used against India so that the coming generations will be affected. He also added that Pakistan can easily devastate India. Now, this may be one of the most blatant nuclear threats that Pakistan has ever issued against India.
Wow. The Pakistan minister also blames India for an old terror attack and reiterated his country's stance in reference to the Uri attack, that it was stage managed by India to portray Pakistan as evil. So the two countries, Katan, continue to go back and forth.
We see that a lot amongst countries. Well, things are also being shaken up overseas. Larry McGee has our report today on the latest around the River Euphrates. Larry, what do you have for us?
The danger of nuclear war erupting is increasing and is apparently growing more imminent by the day. While that might have once been considered to be a baseless, insignificant claim promoted by doomsday sayers, mainstream media is now endorsing the idea, complete with supporting interviews from global analysts and U.S. military officials. Reports are identifying a new Cold War between Russia and the U.S. and are seeking to explore the risk associated with nuclear proliferation between the two powers. Putting its enemies on notice, the U.S. recently allowed an unprecedented glimpse into its nuclear operations inside STRATCOM, as both it and Russia are said to be developing nuclear weapons that make the choice to employ them less difficult. One weapon in the U.S. arsenal designed to get attention and produce large-scale annihilation is the B-52 bomber. It can haul 20 cruise missiles, 6 under each wing, and 8 in its bomb bay, which is constructed to bring nuclear destruction in the same manner as the revolving chamber of a handgun, only with bigger bullets. Though the B-52 has recently been placed on display, military officials say the bomb is more than just a show because it can also deliver. Over the last 2 years, reports are that B-52s have been flying missions not seen since the Cold War to send exactly that message to Russia. The hostile flights are said to have been initiated following the crisis in Ukraine, which ultimately culminated in Russia annexing Crimea. Analysts say the fact that military force would be employed to change an internationally recognized border in the central part of Europe was new, and there was question as to whether or not there was ever any indication that the head of Russia was prepared to use nuclear weapons in the conflict. The response of analysts was President Putin actually said as much himself, citing the Russian leader's comments that he had given an order to the military to be prepared to increase the readiness of Russian nuclear forces in the event that the U.S. and NATO attempted to block Russian intentions with regard to Crimea. On another occasion, President Putin said Russia was not looking for a fight, but they were prepared for the worst-case scenario. This concerns analysts who believe that for Russia, the use of nuclear arms is not unthinkable. That notion is being supported by the Russian military doctrine released in 2014, which states that Russia shall reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. America then upped the ante itself, performing more aggressive exercises over the North Pole and North Sea. The exercises consisted of 4 bombers with the potential of carrying 80 cruise missiles. Hans Christensen, director of the Nuclear Information Project, is using Google Earth to demonstrate the message that sent to Russia with lines superimposed on the world map that show how the flights could have decimated multiple targets in Russia. American military officials say the exercises exhibited a lot of firepower that definitely sent a message, and Russia can draw whatever conclusions that it needs to. In assessing the matter, Rear Admiral Steve Perot says the concern is that in recent years there has been specific public statements made by Russian leaders that indicate an involved willingness to use nuclear weapons in the course of a conflict. He believes that Russia feels that the West is weak socially, and that if they were to use a nuclear weapon in the midst of a conflict, that might be able to shock the Western powers into de-escalating or calling a ceasefire. Overall, analysts say the present concerns are somewhat different from the previous Cold War, whereas the concern then was all-out nuclear war. Now the worry is that a nuclear weapon will be used somewhere in the world by a terrorist group possibly, or one of the many nations such as India and Pakistan, which now have nuclear stockpiles as well. Where U.S. Strategic Command is concerned, however, the biggest issue is Russian military doctrine, which they say is changing in a way that makes the use of a nuclear weapon more likely. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Good time, Jeff. Back to you.
Well, it definitely seems like we're a lot closer to the Cold War heating up with the use of nuclear weapons.
Right. Well, in a recent interview with CBS's Scott Pelley, the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, spoke about the road on their fight with ISIS and the refugee crisis plaguing their country. Now, just a little background, Abdullah became king in 1999 after the death of his father, who ruled for 47 years. Abdullah, referring to ISIS by its Arabic acronym Daesh, says the West doesn't realize that it's in a new third world war. Now, the king said the challenge that's on most minds is it Iraq this year or Syria next year or Boko Haram? We have to look at it from a global perspective.
That's right. Well, he continued, as you see certain military successes in Syria and Iraq against Daesh, they're telling their fighters, speaking of Daesh, either don't come to Syria or Iraq, and they're moving their command structure to Libya. So are we going to wait another year or two and get our act together to concentrate on Libya? Or do we wait a year or two to start helping the Africans start to deal with Boko Haram? So we've got to get ahead of the curve, he said, because they're reacting much quicker than we are.
The American strategy in Iraq and Syria is to use air forces to train fighters on the ground, but that has not worked. When asked how do you move forward, Abdullah said the problem with the West is that they see a border between Iraq and Syria, but Daesh does not. And this has been a problem for our Western coalition partners because their lawyers get into the act and say there's an international border. And until they realize that the enemy doesn't play by the West rules, we're not going to win this.
So basically, Daesh doesn't care about borders. They go wherever they want to do and do what they want to do. Yeah. Jordan says it has flown more than 1,000 missions against ISIS in Syria in coordination with the U.S. Last year, pilot Muwath Kusabe was captured, and ISIS put him in a cage and made a video of burning him alive. At that time, King Abdullah had 2 terrorists in jail. Within hours of that video being released, Jordan hanged those terrorists, and the king said that they need to, referring to Daesh, understand that there's no messing around with Jordan. Those who were involved with that pilot's capture and his death have been taken down.
King Abdullah said they're hunting down each and every person in the video, and if it takes another 50 years to get them, we will, because those are the rules of his neighborhood. Now keep in mind, Katan, there's the issue with the refugees fleeing from Syria as well in the midst of all this fighting, and Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institute and Margaret Brennan, CBS Foreign Affairs correspondent, spoke to CBS News about Jordan's role fighting ISIS recently.
That's right. He said, O'Hanlon said, they're referring to Jordan, number 3 in the area for resettling refugees. So in regards to them handling the humanitarian part of it, they're extremely crucial. And of course, they share the border with Syria. That is Syria being north of Jordan. So for people driven from those areas because of the war, basically Jordan is their only hope.
Yeah. To give you an idea about Jordan, Abdullah's reign is over an area that's about the size of the state of Indiana, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to his west, north of him, Syria's civil war, to the east, ISIS in Iraq, and to the south, fundamentalist Islam in Saudi Arabia. It is a collision of tribes and religions, not confined by borders, drawn with a British T-square and crossed by American tanks.
That's right. Well, in 1990, King Hussein warned the president, then George H. Bush, to stay out of Iraq. And in 2003, the son of the king gave the son of the president then, who would have been George W. Bush, the same advice. Well, Abdullah's frustration in the matter comes as what he says advisors and think tanks in the West think they know us, referring to the people in that region, better than we know ourselves. When this conflict started in Syria, everyone, referring to the West again, was saying, oh, 6 months, basically we'll have it taken care of. And I was saying 6 years. We're in for the long haul, not only for Syria and Iraq, but for the whole region and the whole world.
When the king was asked if there had to be a Western army of some kind on the ground to help fight this, Abdullah said, enablers, because you can't have Western troops walking down the streets of Syrian neighborhoods, because at the end of the day, you need the Syrians to be able to do that. In 2014, CBS cameras were on the Syrian borders as the king's soldiers reached out and welcomed them, even though they already had 2 million Palestinian refugees who had been in Jordan for more than 2 decades. So they're already full, but they were still taking more on.
Yeah, and definitely affecting them. Jordan allowed 1.5 million Syrians into the country because they really didn't have much of a choice, according to the king. He continued, they were flooding across the borders and being shot by the Syrian regime, and Jordan has always been a place that's opened its arms to refugees from other countries, unfortunately. But then it got to a point where we're now at 20%, he said, increase in their population and a huge burden on our country, and we're in dire straits.
Most of the refugees are in Jordanian towns looking for work and driving up rent. 160,000 Syrian children are in Jordanian schools. When the king was asked, what's the breaking point for you people? He said, about a year or 2 ago. Unemployment is skyrocketing, our health sector is saturated, our schools are going through really difficult times, and Jordanians are up to their heads, and we just can't take it anymore.
That's right. Well, with wars continuing to loom on the horizon, retaliation amongst the nations, and it seems like the entire world is reaching its breaking point, the question is, what can we do to turn this around? Well, Yisrael Hawkins and the House of Yahweh has the answers, in fact, the peaceful solution to stop all wars. To find out more, you can contact the House of Yahweh.
When you contact the House of Yahweh, don't forget to request your free Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website at www.ypnnews.com. And for any email, you can email at info@yahweh.com. And any calls coming from outside the United States, please call the number on your screen. And once again, we'd like to draw your attention to the Yisrael Says program, the best study Bible tool out there on the market today. And you can find that by going to www.yisraelsays.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next, Yisrael Hawkins bringing forth the solution of peace. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.